I live in an ordinary Moscow five-story walk-up, apartment 47. Next door, naturally, is the apartment whose door bears a slightly crooked yellow placard with the number 48. That's the apartment this story is about. And no, getting ahead of the obvious question, as far as I know, no one has ever died in that apartment in its 40-year history. The people who lived there never complained about strange noises or visions or chairs sliding across the floor on their own. By every measure, it's a perfectly average one-room flat with all the amenities, an ideal place for young singles or not-so-young ones. It doesn't even have a bad reputation among the building's residents. There were never any stories or legends about a cursed apartment. Not once. If I think about it, I'm probably the first and only person who noticed that something wrong was happening in apartment 48. And only because I live right next door. I've lived in this building for 28 years, and in that time the apartment has had 6 tenants. Given that it's been a rental since Soviet days, that's not an unusually high number. But the circumstances under which each tenant left were remarkable. When I first moved into apartment 47, the neighboring unit was occupied by a respectable-looking pensioner in glasses, the very image of the Soviet intelligentsia. As befitted an educated man of that era, he subscribed to a thick stack of newspapers and magazines, and I often ran into him on the stairwell. We'd exchange greetings, sometimes a few words about the weather or football matches. We were both passionate Spartak fans. About 2 years in, I noticed that the old man's mail had begun to thin out. No more thick journals or specialty publications, just Pravda and Izvestia. Then even those stopped coming, and the mailbox for apartment 48 went empty. During the period when Pravda was still being delivered, I would occasionally see my neighbor in the entryway, and his appearance made it plain that something was seriously wrong with his health. 5 years after I'd moved in, he left for good. Word was he'd gone to live in the countryside, and that last time I saw him the day he moved out, he left me with a heavy feeling I couldn't shake. Sunken gray cheeks, dead eyes, brittle white hair coming out in patches, trembling hands, the frame of a man wasted to nothing. He was a pale shadow of the plump, energetic old fellow I'd met 5 years before. The apartment sat empty for a couple of months after he left. Then a young working man moved in. I never managed to establish much of a connection with him. He was always in a hurry, kept to himself, out early every morning and back late every evening. That was at first. A couple of years passed and he started spending much more time inside his apartment. There was some whispering that he'd gotten into serious trouble at work and been fired. Gradually, it became clear that the former worker had taken hard to the bottle. The rare times I spotted him in the entryway or around the building, he always had a bag in his hand, either a large can of beer or a bottle of Russkaya vodka. His appearance transformed the way any man's does when he's going to pieces fast. Filthy, rumpled clothes, the permanent reek of alcohol, a sickly thinness, dark circles under his eyes, puffy skin. In 5 years, he aged a full quarter century. Then he died, got into a fight one night in line for another bottle and was stabbed. The next tenant was a middle-aged man. What set him apart was that he drove an enormous black SUV with tinted windows. This was the mid-90s, and that kind of vehicle left no doubt about what circle you ran in. I can't say much about him with certainty. He seemed to run some of the street kiosks that had sprouted up all over the city like mushrooms after rain, ended up in the hospital after a run-in with some gangsters, brought women home who were obviously in the trade. I had my own serious problems at the time and wasn't paying close attention to my neighbors' lives. But over the 5 years the businessman lived in apartment 48, he too dwindled away to nothing. By the end of his stay, the red-cheeked tough with the bulldog stare had become a shaking wreck who could barely drag himself up the stairs, his sparse hair shedding with every step. You could blame a high-stress profession in the after-effects of those hospital stays, of course. But still, after the Novy Ruski vanished without a trace, the apartment didn't stay empty long. This time it was a woman with a child of about 5. Word was she worked as an accountant. During the day she went to her job and left the child alone. Apparently nursery school was either too expensive or the waiting list was endless, as usual. And what do you think happened? 2 years in, when the child was old enough to start school, she quit her job and stopped going out, and refused to send the child to school either. Social services workers came to see her, and she made such a scene that I could hear every word through the wall of my apartment. They came back several more times, but eventually they seemed to give up. This went on for several years, until one day while I was away, It was summer. I was down south on holiday. The neighbors heard loud crying and called the police. They broke down the door and found the woman unconscious in a tub of scalding water. Ischemic stroke. She was revived, I was told later, but she'd gone too long without medical attention and never fully recovered. What became of the child? Whether they put him in an orphanage or found relatives willing to take him, I don't know. But Fyodor Andreevich from apartment 45 told me that the woman herself had looked like a living corpse. Waxy skin, a slack, sunken face, some kind of sores on her arms and neck, and she couldn't have weighed more than 40 kilos. It was after this fourth tenant, and after Andreich's vivid account, that something clicked into place for me. The sequence of events had assembled itself into a pattern that turned my stomach, and I made a decision. From that point on, I was going to watch apartment 48 very carefully. The fifth was another retired man living alone. That, however, was where any resemblance to the quiet, courteous intellectual from the 80s ended. This one was a sour, hunched little old man, perpetually muttering under his breath, treating everyone who crossed his path to a venomous glare from those sharp, glittering eyes. He was hard of hearing, and every evening he'd blast his television at full volume, which kept me awake and drove me absolutely mad. Any complaint was met with a shrill, cawing tirade. He'd report this, he'd report that. They were persecuting a sick old man, violating his rights. In short, he was a thoroughly unpleasant neighbor. Over the 4 years that followed, watching him deteriorate with almost unseemly speed, I felt little in the way of pity. He went from hobbling with a cane to barely managing at all. He went completely bald. He lost half his teeth. Eventually, he went nearly blind. It was the blindness in the end that got him shipped off to a nursing home. They practically had to carry him out, and the whole way he cursed at the top of his lungs. The orderlies, the ungrateful relatives who decided to get rid of him, to pack him off to rot in some institution. The apartment's current tenant has been living there for nearly 4 years now. She's a young woman, a student who came from somewhere out in the provinces and got into university. Whether she's still enrolled, I honestly can't say. The first time I saw her, fresh-faced, pretty, just stepping out into adult life, my heart sank. I worked up the nerve one evening and knocked on her door. I told her everything I knew about that apartment and advised her to find somewhere else to live. She clearly thought I was a senile old crank. She laughed it off. Oh, she promised she'd look into it, but only to get rid of me. In practice, she went right on living there, and she's living there still. Though she did stop going to her classes at some point, and again the question nagged at me. How does she pay the rent? Who actually owns that apartment? In 28 years, I've never once laid eyes on a landlord. Tenants moved in and moved out entirely on their own. A few days ago, just before the May holidays, I ran into my neighbor on the landing. That was a rare thing in itself. She'd all but vanished from sight 6 months ago. She looked terrible. Her face had gone gaunt, her cheekbones sharp, her eyes bulging and threaded through with red. The whole time we spoke, I could hear her grinding her teeth. She reminded me of a junkie. Maybe that's what she'd become. Are you all right? I asked. Fine, she said, edging past me. Everything's fine. You don't look well. Do you remember what I told you? A few years back, about your apartment? I remember. She looked at me with naked hostility, as though I'd said something unforgivable. Are you going to let me by? Sorry, I stepped aside. All the same, you should move out, while you still can. She took a couple of steps toward her door, then stopped and turned when my words caught up with her. Her face looked like a skull. I'm happy there, she said. There's no reason to move. You have no idea how good it is. How good it is there. Then she went to her door and fumbled with the lock, keys rattling, and stepped inside and slammed it shut, and I heard the iron bolt slide home from the other side. I stood there for a few seconds staring at the crooked yellow number plate, 48. Then sighed and went back to my own apartment.